Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, in 2018, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated in a premeditated extrajudicial killing at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul by agents of the Saudi government and at the alleged instruction of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He was dismembered and removed from the building in pieces. During his 2020 presidential run, Joe Biden, eager to distinguish himself from Trump, who had downplayed MBS's role in Khashoggi's murder, said this.
Mr. Vice President, the CIA has concluded that the leader of Saudi Arabia directed the murder of U.S.-based journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The State Department also says the Saudi government is responsible for executing nonviolent offenders and for torture. President Trump has not punished senior Saudi leaders. Would you?
Yes, and I said it at the time. Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. And I would also, as pointed out, I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sale of material to the Saudis, who they're going in and murdering children and they're murdering innocent people. And so they have to be held accountable.
But that was then, and this is now. And with high oil prices quickly becoming the defining issue of midterm elections, Biden appears to be reneging on his campaign promise to make Saudi Arabia a, quote, pariah and hold it accountable for its human rights abuses. Next month, Biden will head to Saudi Arabia where, according to CNN, he is expected to engage in some capacity with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. A senior administration official told reporters on Monday, "We're now in a place where we feel this will come together in a very constructive way for everyone involved, and the president's looking forward to it." I bet. This weekend, Biden told reporters that the trip was unrelated to sticker shock at the pump, that it had nothing to do with the fact that America had been leaning on Saudi-led OPEC Plus to increase oil production and bring down prices. But to most observers, the motives are as obvious as the blood on MBS's hands. Biden's defenders are championing the move despite Biden's hypocrisy, saying that Biden is right to kowtow to Saudi Arabia if it means helping democratic political outcomes. At The Atlantic, Andrew Exum argued that the president is right to sacrifice his values in the interest of something we haven't seen much of in the past 2 decades, realism. Meanwhile, Biden's critics, like Glenn Greenwald, pointed out that The Atlantic ran very different headlines when it was Trump canoodling with Saudi Arabia versus Biden. For Trump, the truth about Jamal Khashoggi is beside the point, wrote Kathy Gilson. David Graham announced that Trump's visit was the end of American lip service to human rights. Well, what that last title does get right is that Americans' commitment to global human rights has always been little more than lip service. While Biden administration contends to prosecute Julian Assange for telling the truth about Afghanistan and Guantanamo remains open after 20 years, America is still holding out, along with Somalia and South Sudan, as the only countries not to have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. As journalist Abby Martin pointed out in an exchange with Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the Summit of the Americas just last week, are your 2 greatest allies in the Middle East, she asked, Saudi Arabia, are your 2 greatest allies in the Middle East. They have murdered American journalists, and there have been actually no repercussions. Why, she asked, is there no accountability? Now, if I'm dragging my feet in answering that rhetorical question, I apologize. It's just so obvious, I sort of don't think you need me to spell it out. The answer is that foreign policy decisions are rarely, if ever, motivated by morals, ethics, or anything that vaguely whiffs of sincere humanitarian concerns. Won't somebody think of the children hand-wringing as little more than an ex-post rationalization for imperialism/corporate economic interests? As Martin Luther King Jr. observed, millions of citizens are deeply disturbed that the military-industrial complex too often shapes national policy, but they don't want to be considered unpatriotic. Now, this is an obvious point, but it's important to say that this doesn't mean that humanitarian motives don't exist or that there might not be sincerely held moral imperatives driving the widespread Western support for, say, the war in Ukraine. But the reason America gets involved in that conflict, while Saudi Arabia commits ongoing war crimes in Yemen, has everything to do with our energy dependency on Saudi oil and nothing to do with the value of Yemeni or Ukrainian lives. And yet those of us who criticize U.S. involvement in Ukraine because it's a pretext for expanding U.S. hegemony and juicing the military-industrial complex are constantly maligned as indifferent to the suffering of Ukrainians, or worse, sympathetic to Putin's invasion. At the start of the conflict, leftists raised concerns that U.S. sanctions on Russia would not have the desired effect on Russian leadership, but that they would hurt Russian citizens and the global community. And now, even Biden officials are, quote, privately expressing concern that rather than dissuade the Kremlin as intended, U.S. sanctions have instead exacerbated inflation, worsened food insecurity, and punished ordinary Russians more than Putin or his allies. Oops. I guess I forgive you for calling me Putin's puppet for articulating that very concern on Bad Faith Podcast back in February, but this isn't about I told you so's. This is about having a clear-eyed understanding of what motivates U.S. foreign policy going forward. We were told that Russian oil must be sanctioned because we were defending freedom.
This is a step that we're taking to inflict further pain on Putin. But there will be cost as well here in the United States. I said I would level with the American people from the beginning. And when I first spoke to this, I said defending freedom is going to cost. It's going to cost us as well in the United States.
And yet, next month, Biden is going hat in hand to Saudi Arabia, notable defender of freedom, to try to convince them to do what they haven't been willing to do so far. Play ball. He's literally going to beg one human rights violator so that he can afford to sanction another human rights violator's oil. What a world we live in. Here's a quick gloss, if you've forgotten, of what Saudi Arabia's human rights violations really have been. Here's a list from Amnesty International. Saudi Arabia uses torture as punishment, denies free speech, discriminates on the basis of religion, and bans human rights organizations entirely from the country. Saudi-led airstrikes on homes, hospitals, and communication towers in Yemen have been characterized as war crimes. Hundreds of thousands have died from either direct conflict or hunger in the region. Airstrikes alone have killed almost 24,000 people in Yemen, including 9,000 civilians, according to conservative estimates. Now, comparisons are odious, but if the United States is going to leverage public sympathy, as Biden has done, to justify military action that negatively impacts the American workers' ability to make ends meet, it has to explain why Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a basis to leverage American futures, but Yemeni children are not. When the last president showed this level of indifference to stated American values, CNN wrote it up as the Trump doctrine laid bare, saying, by letting Saudi Arabia get away with the murder of U.S.-based journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the president sent a message of startling clarity about how the United States will conduct its business in the world. Trump effectively told global despots that if they side with him, Washington will turn a blind eye to actions that infringe traditional U.S. values. Trump made clear that Washington has a price, that principles that generations of Americans have cherished are for sale. To be clear, it's not that that write-up is wrong, it's just too narrow. It should be a bipartisan criticism. Regrettably, oftentimes, an American criticism. In Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984, the three major nation states at war with each other are constantly shifting alliances. And the people were expected to accept old allies as new enemies and vice versa as quickly as the ink the news propaganda was written on dried. There were no real allegiances. The justification for fighting followed the elite rationale for doing so. And likewise, we're told to root for this military action because justice and freedom, while we ignore untold abuses elsewhere because we don't get anything from doing the right thing. And that's how it will go, at least until the geopolitical context shifts and the people we once sold weapons to become terrorists and sworn enemies, and then allies, and then enemies, and then allies, and then enemies, all while the working people of the world hold the bag. So you might recognize one of those last images from the end of, I think it's Rocky III, where it's dedicated to the brave fighters of the Mujahideen, who, how many times do we have to do this? We give weapons to a certain part of the world, often in an effort to fight Russia, often in some kind of Cold War battle for global hegemony. And then we turn around, oopsie daisy, 20, 30 years later and realize those very weapons are being used against our own interests at the time.
Yeah, it's one of the most clear-eyed things that Trump ever said. He said to Bill O'Reilly, it's my favorite Trump quote, Bill says, well, Putin's a killer. And Trump says, a lot of killers, Bill. You think we're so innocent? A lot of killers. It was true.
It's true.
It's a confusing and a harsh world out there. There's a lot of bad people. We've done a lot of bad things. We've done a lot of bad things historically. We do some bad things now still. And it's just we need a consistent approach. Either we're going to say, you know what, these countries have to work out their own problems, and we're going to continue to trade with them because that makes the people of America better off, which makes their people better off too, and then hopefully they become more prosperous, more educated about democracy and values like that, and they do something about their tyrannical government. That's one approach. The other approach, the approach we seem to take, is we do that and then occasionally get really mad about some policy and then retaliate wildly against those governments without seeming to have any improvement on those countries at all.
Yeah, when the conflict first started and I was eager to understand it and having guests on my podcast, I remember asking Matt Des, Bernie's foreign policy guy, look, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm playing catch up like much of the world was at the time. But can you articulate to me the principle that justifies our involvement here and not here, and all these other places in the world where the money could save more lives per dollar, whether it's buying malarial nets or purifying water or actually getting involved in a war or sanctioning Saudi Arabia for its actions in Yemen. And there is none. And sometimes people say, well, Ukraine's sort of NATO adjacent.
Right.
Like, no, that's the whole point.
But that's a different argument too, right? You can't use the humanitarian argument. You can say, look, sorry, it is Ukraine is in close proximity to allied countries of ours, and we have a strategic interest. Russia is a more geopolitical, large global rival. We have a just real talk national security interest in stopping them or punishing them or harming them for doing this. You can't make the humanitarian argument because then we do have to do something about Saudi Arabia, Yemen, all sorts of things that we shouldn't, that we can't, that makes no sense to pick and choose. So similarly, I think it is not necessarily wrong to say we should play ball with Saudi Arabia and overlook these things so that the people of the
about it.
Exactly.
Right, because when you use the humanitarian excuses, it sets you up to use those excuses to do all kinds of things that Americans might not feel like was a good bargain in the short term, because it's not necessarily about raising the prices at the gas pump. It's about some other kind of corporate military industrial interest that is not necessarily aligned with the interests of the American people.
Wow, a lot of killers, Bri.
A lot of killers out there.
Well, thank you so much. We'll have more Rising in just a minute.